So on to part 3 of my ridiculously random sculpture review. Once again, I'm not always going to pose the questions written on the slide. I'll assume that you will read them on the slide. I'm also not labeling these works. First, see if you can identify them, and if not, look them up. These are both statues of God, Apollo and Nike, and both stand on high places. The Nike was designed to stand on a rock with a fountain, mimicking the prow of a boat on the sea. Her missing right arm may have held a victory crown. At any rate, both statues are reaching out into negative space, which is an innovation of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman sculpture. Both were monumental, muscular, and in motion. Both are meant to be seen from below. Now here we see the Nike of Samothrace compared with Neo-Guardian figures or Vajrapani. Note that we have represented images from both Longmen caves in China and the Todaiji temple in Japan. These are personages that have migrated from Hinduism to Buddhism. They are warlike figures who guard the Buddha in his travels. Remember that both the Longmen Caves complex and the Todaiji temple were designed to showcase and bolster the rule of emperors. Wu Zetian was a controversial female emperor. Emperor Shomu embraced Buddhism as a way of stabilizing his nation and rule during a time when Japan was recovering from disunity and economic troubles. And you can see how these figures might appeal to emperors who used Buddhism to support their rule, but also needed to protect and expand their empires through warfare. Buddhism embraces peace. Emperors tend to employ warriors. Enter the Neo-Guardians. Note the dynamism of movement, especially strong in contrast with the very still depictions of the Vairocana Buddha in the Longmen Caves and the Great Buddha in Todaiji. Actually, although it's hard to tell with the Hindu statues, the figures in both works are clothed. The nude sculpture is mostly a feature of Western art. Again, both of these sculptures display a great deal of twisting movement, but the Hindu sculpture is more deliberately sensual. Note that the two on the left are both images of the Vairocana Buddha or Celestial Buddha. Japanese Emperor Shomu, again, was probably deliberately copying the Longmen Cave images. So, why am I not showing you any Islamic sculpture? You all got that one, right? Figural images are forbidden. Before we move on to Christian sculpture, let's look briefly at this specific deity, a female deity from Nucorno. Any observations? Obviously, the sculpture is highly stylized. Its sleek lines suit our modern sensibilities, but in fact, when it was used, the statue was dressed in garments or decorated during festivals. Something else you might need to know about these figures is they influenced modernist sculptors such as Henry Moore, not one of our required artists to my regret. The theme of the Moore work on the right is protection. So many of the labels on these slides are from old AP tests before the curriculum changed. That is, their old AP questions. So, why did my European sculpture discussion, which admittedly has lurched around, jump from the Ludovisi sarcophagus to this work, or almost 900 years? Well, in Europe, it took this much time for the stone sculpture tradition to revive. So what did the Byzantines use instead to decorate their churches? Mosaics. So here are some close-ups of the Romanesque tympanoid conch. Note Christ pointing to heaven and earth, remarkably similar to some of the Buddhist mudras, although of course there wouldn't have been any cross influence. But what difference do you note between the figures of heaven and hell? We see a contrast between order and chaos in the way the composition is organized. In other words, form is itself signaling content. So, okay, once again, I'm leaving sculpture for a moment. But think about the differences and similarities in the message here. The early Christian, early Byzantine art on the bottom right shows Christ still young and beardless. That's going to change very soon. Byzantine images tend to show Christ as Pantocrator, or ruler of the world, like the image above. Romanesque images of Christ often focus on his role as judge of sinners and saved. Note that early Christian art still shows some of the naturalism of classical art. That's a very common question. On to Gothic sculpture. The west portals of Chartres Cathedral actually were one of the last parts of the Romanesque church of Chartres, and they survived the devastating fire of 1194. So these portals are usually viewed as the major monument of early Gothic sculpture, and I would call them transitional. So, who are the royals, and what message are they sending? This is a common question on the College Board, and don't be fooled. Although only kings and bishops and high church officials could enter through these doors, these are not French kings. They are Old Testament kings and queens, consciously making a connection with French royalty. Again, sculpture using religion to support the state. These are also figures that are seen as prefiguring Christ. The west portal tympani show different episodes from the life of Christ. In Gothic sculpture in general, we see more emphasis on Christ's humanity, his role as the learned teacher, and generally more human figure. Note also the increasing significance of the Virgin Mary, although Mary on the throne of wisdom is actually a popular theme of Romanesque art. So, of the 12th century windows that survived, only this figure of Mary and the large windows at the west end were deemed worthy of reusing by the 13th century Gothic master. But here again we see Mary on the throne of wisdom. And here is the central tympanum with Christ surrounded by a mandorla, another one of those art history terms. So how is this different from the Last Judgment scene of the Conques Cathedral tympanum? There is not so much focus on hellfire and brimstone. Again, Christianity is becoming more humanistic. So the work on the right is no longer required, but I can imagine you're needing to know that Gothic sculpture becomes more realistic and emotional, with figures interacting and sculpted in higher relief. Here's another late Gothic example that used to show up in the AP test all the time. This sculpture, which is required, reflects the horrors of the 14th century and the religious response. The self-confidence of high Gothic Christian humanism is fading, yet this statue also represents humanism taken to a new level, with more emotion, more movement, and more freeing of sculpture from its architectural surroundings. This work is also an AP favorite and a required work. So this comparison really illustrates the move from early Renaissance to high Renaissance to Baroque. Bernini's David, you know, it is emotional, twisted. Michelangelo's David, the worship of the human body, the influence of Hellenistic sculpture. So what makes this Baroque? It's all about theater, and it's multimedia, another feature of Baroque art influenced by the theater. Note, too, the twisted figures and the highly emotional expression. Baroque artists admired and imitated Hellenistic Greek sculpture. And here's the full set with patrons in the audience.